This review for Crash Bandicoot will analyse the entire game in depth. Those who played the game will get the most out of this video. This is the first in what will eventually be a series of 11 reviews focusing on the most prominent games to be developed by Naughty Dog. First, to briefly touch on why I won't be considering the games developed by Naughty Dog prior to Crash Bandicoot, I present a quote from Naughty Dog's official website. Although we have sometimes claimed to have started in 1984, we were just working on garage titles back then, to be honest. Things really got started in 1994 when we began working on Crash Bandicoot. There is no further mention of Naughty Dog's earliest games anywhere on their website, suggesting to me that they don't believe them to be relevant anymore. It's also worth noting that all of Naughty Dog's games prior to Crash were largely developed by just two people, Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin, the founders of Jam Software, which later became Naughty Dog. Both have since left the company, meaning that no one who worked at Naughty Dog prior to Crash still works there. Crash Bandicoot was developed by Naughty Dog Inc. and released in 1996 for the original PlayStation. It was both the first platformer and the first PlayStation game they had worked on. The game begins. Unless the player waits for the attract mode video to begin playing, the player is thrown into the game with no pretensions of plot. If the player does wait for the video, however, they learn that Crash is the result of a failed experiment carried out by two game developers, recording dialogue in their garage with bad microphones but plenty of enthusiasm.
We are closer than ever before. Quickly, into the vortex! The Dr. Cortex, the vortex is not ready. We have no idea what it could do.
In all seriousness, in an era when video game voice actors were unheard of and the developers had to do the voiceover themselves if they wanted it at all, I'm not going to fault anyone for being earnest. The cutscene does as good a job as any in quickly setting up the hero, the villains, and the damsel in distress in the space of a minute. Crash was released in the early days of 3D gaming, when developers were just starting to figure out how they could utilise that whole extra dimension. Crash took an interesting and somewhat unique approach to this dilemma. It sidestepped it. The game plays out in 3 dimensions, certainly, but the rigidly linear paths the levels follow allowed the developers to design the game with the same sensibilities as a 2-dimensional game. A typical Crash level has the player travelling on an extremely linear path either away from or towards the camera, meaning that while the Z-axis is used for progression and the Y-axis is used for jumping, the X-axis is barely used at all, as the player can only move a few steps to either side of the screen. However, designing for two axes means that it doesn't matter which axis is which. In the end, you've got 2 dimensions to work with. One is for jumping and elevation and the other for forwards progression, so by positioning the camera behind Crash's back instead of at the accustomed 2D perspective, the developers were able to step into a whole new dimension of game development without changing their established design habits, polygons aside. There are exceptions, of course, where 2 or 3 obstacles are placed at the same point along the X-axis, but these are few and far between and don't play into the strengths of the design. In terms of the final product, this approach made every level a forwards gauntlet through numerous platforming challenges and obstacles, interspersed with some extremely light combat, which is never intended to be difficult. The most complex this ever gets is figuring out whether to spin attack or jump on an enemy's head. The game never once requires the exploration of open 3D space. The path of progression is always abundantly clear. This is to say nothing of the fixed camera angle 2D sections that make up about half of the game. These discard any pretensions at 3-dimensional movement whatsoever, and are simply the 2D platforming stages of console generations prior, spruced up with polygonal graphics. I'd assume these sections were included for variety, but considering that the 3D levels were more or less 2D in nature already, the side-on 2D sections were entirely derivative. And that's exactly how the game was received. Critics at the time called it derivative and unoriginal, but today we would probably sooner call it arcadey. The game's runaway success as an early 3D platformer is definitely due, in part, to this 2D in 3D approach. The third dimension was intimidating, so Crash was the stepping stone. The visuals are undeniably 3D, but the level design seldom put that third dimension to use. It's also worth noting that the player is never asked to control the camera. It's fixed and on rails at all times, in the absence of analog sticks. I want to clarify that none of this is intended as negative criticism on my part. I think this was a resourceful approach to 3D game design, and I don't mean to suggest that the design is somehow inherently lazy. However, the fixed camera angles do create some of the perspective issues that were present in a lot of early 3D games. For example, there's no way for me to know if this platform is right up against the floor Crash is standing on, or if there's a gap between them and the platform is slightly lower in elevation. This can lead to some frustrating deaths that are the fault of perspective tricks, which 2D sections are much less prone to. Nowadays, however, you're only going to observe all that if you can get past the controls, which are a product of early 3D growing pains and have indisputably aged. The first and most immediate example of archaic controls a player will run into is the D-pad movement. The first iteration of the PS1 controller didn't have analog sticks, so like any other game that used a directional pad to navigate a 3D environment, the game's age is inherent in the movement inputs. If you find you're able to adjust, however, this is actually one of the less intrusive issues with the controls. Very rarely is the player asked to make difficult movements in any direction but the 4 cardinal ones, those being the 4 directions represented on a D-pad. In this case, the developers were clearly aware of the restrictions of the hardware and designed their game with this in mind. Diagonal jumps are extremely few and far between. Still, controlling any 3D game with a D-pad just feels inferior, and no amount of design compensation can alleviate that. This may be another reason the game contains so many side-scrolling sections, as they'd always been a better fit for a D-pad. The less obvious but more damaging problem in the long run is instead the way Crash carries his momentum. He takes a split second to slow down once the player releases the D-pad, and therefore feels very heavy, which is exacerbated by the amount of momentum he carries into a jump. The player has to commit to their jumps very seriously because of minimal mid-air control. It's impossible to bring Crash to a stop in mid-air without madly rocking your thumb back and forth on the D-pad, which, while imprecise, is also just damn uncomfortable. For this type of platformer, letting go of the D-pad to stop on a dime would have sufficed, Mega Man style. What's interesting about that last point is that jumps with high commitment are absolutely a viable mechanic if the game is designed around them. See the NES Castlevanias. To a certain extent, Crash actually is largely designed around the jump commitment, because the player is rarely asked to jump any distance except the maximum length of the jump. This feels like a compromise for poor physics rather than an intentional design choice, however. There's no clear reason why more platforming challenges couldn't have been designed around a series of gaps of different sizes. This is one of the most elementary ways to challenge a player in all of game design history. Asking a player to judge the size of a gap and then make an appropriate jump is one of the most fundamental concepts in platformer design. Since most of the game's jumps are the same length, however, there's nothing stimulating about the act of jumping, despite the fact that the game is a platformer. Therefore, the design seems to be based around compensation for physics that wouldn't cooperate, rather than being the original intent. I'd imagine that getting the physics right was one of the biggest hurdles when transitioning into 3D, so while in a critical context the physics are a black mark against the game, in a historical context it was probably a necessary learning experience for the developers. This compromise was still a better choice than trying to force it though, as illustrated by the 2 levels that do demand the player space their jumps with skill. The 2 levels featuring collapsing bridges, called Road to Nowhere and The High Road, are the only levels in the game that regularly demand skillful jumping from the player. It's hard to demonstrate with game footage just how awful these levels feel to play. All the problems with the D-pad controls and physics culminate here to show exactly why the game, as it is now, cannot facilitate this type of precise platforming. The fact that these levels are included at all suggests to me that the developers just tried to force it after getting sick of making so many compromises to their original design. I'd imagine that a lot of nostalgic players who have revisited the game recently gave up once they reached the high road, and I wouldn't blame them. The third and least major problem is the fact that Crash carries his speed into a spin attack. If I move Crash forward, spin attack, then immediately stop holding forwards when the spin attack begins, Crash will carry his velocity and continue on at his running speed until the spin ends. This can lead to a couple of frustrating falls off of small platforms. This seems like one of those issues that a developer with 1,000 different things to worry about just couldn't find the time to fix. If the game's controls don't hold up, then we have to look elsewhere for the game's redeeming qualities, and these come in the form of gameplay variety. The first two levels introduce the basic linear level design that the game will use throughout. The player will probably stumble across the strange and unique save system that the game uses. Crash needs to find 3 bonus head icons in each stage, which will transport him to a very brief 2.5D bonus stage. Only if the player completes that do they get the chance to save or obtain a password. Not all levels contain these bonus stages, and if the player gets a game over, they're usually sent back to whichever level they last accessed a bonus stage in. This certainly gives a unique value to collectibles that I don't think I've seen before or since, but I don't say that in a positive sense. Certain types of games can use long stretches of time between save points to heighten tension, but Crash definitely would have benefited from a traditional save system. The other unique way the game gives value to collectibles is how they can be lost if Crash spin attacks them. Even extra lives can be sent flying off screen. This creates an interesting pacing where the player can move through levels as fast as they wish most of the time, but then has to exercise some patience when breaking open crates. I'm not convinced that the game gains a whole lot by having this mechanic, but it's certainly novel and allows Crash to interact with common collectibles in a way I haven't seen repeated elsewhere. The third level introduces the 2.5D side-scrolling perspective shift, which allows the developers to create more vertical scenarios that would have been difficult to frame from a behind-the-back perspective, without creating more perspective issues. Next, Naughty Dog introduces its penchant for set pieces with an Indiana Jones-style escape from a rolling boulder. The camera is placed at a perspective that makes it hard to see the approaching obstacles, so this stage is made extremely easy to compensate. Some of the jumps look treacherous, but they're all spaced so that a player would have to be actively trying to sabotage themselves in order to miss them. You wouldn't know that on your first attempt though, and the point of this stage is spectacle, not challenge. The jumps and other obstacles are placed to add to the pressure of the speeding boulder. I know that when I think of Crash Bandicoot, this stage is often the first image that comes to mind, and I'm definitely not alone in that. The Upstream Stage is interesting in that there is more instant death water than there are safe places to stand. It's also framed from an almost top-down perspective, restricting the player's view. This is because, with so much water to fall into, it's more important to see where Crash is going to land than to see far ahead. There's a pathetically easy boss that isn't worth talking about, and from here the rest of the game cycles through these different styles of gameplay. Regular behind-the-back stages, side-on 2D sections, one-off set pieces like the boulder chase or the auto-run hog ride, top-down river levels, and bad boss battles all reappear when needed to keep the player engaged. This is the game's biggest strength and its greatest redeeming quality when going back to play it today. The game never becomes repetitive or falls into a rut, as most levels have a unique gimmick that keeps the player doing something new. Few level gimmicks are ever used more than twice. The hog ride and flashlight mechanics even get secret levels to expand on the concepts and push the difficulty to the absolute limit. Speaking of the auto-run hog ride levels, they rely a little too heavily on trial and error, and you would probably need to be clairvoyant to beat these on your first try. They're a weak point for the game overall, but only one of them is mandatory, and they speed by so fast that, again, the spectacle is enjoyable enough that the design doesn't become too much of an issue. Also, Crash's shit-eating grin is yet to be surpassed in gaming. There's not a whole lot else to talk about in terms of level design once the game begins cycling through these gameplay styles, so I'll just point out a few level gimmicks I particularly like. This level in Cortex's facility uses a top-down perspective without an overabundance of water to fall into, and instead designs different types of challenges around the camera angle. The level's slippery climb is extremely challenging, but in a good way because it takes the limitations of the controls into account. Here's a tip: holding X makes Crash bounce higher off of enemies. The Lights Out level cleverly repurposes the health power-up as a slowly fading flashlight. And one I didn't. I've already talked at length about jumping, but it must be said that having to jump over any obstacle while on a moving platform is a nightmarish task with these controls. Despite the difficulty of the game, the only level I became truly angry at was the last one before the final boss. The way Crash moves around with digital input just doesn't lend itself well to avoiding the movement patterns and timings of the enemies introduced in this stage. With that said, it is impressive that new enemy types are still being introduced in the final level. The game ends with a battle against Cortex atop his blimp while his castle burns. The fight itself is short, easy, and nothing to write home about, but the setting was impressive at the time. It looks primitive today, but flying in circles on top of a blimp around a burning castle was an ambitious visual to try to create on the PS1, and Naughty Dog pulled it off fairly convincingly given the technology they had. Crash Bandicoot has aged. A lot of older games need you to meet them halfway to enjoy them, but Crash requires you to meet it, well, all of the way. The ethereal concept of bad game feel hangs over the entire game, which is a difficult idea to contextualize. The game shows its age the most at the very core of player interaction, both in real-world controller input options and their in-game representations as momentum and physics. It's impressive then that despite the game having problems at its very core, all the surrounding elements make Crash Bandicoot a game that is still worth playing. If you're willing to meet it all the way, and cast your mind back to a dark time when we played 3D games with D-pads, there is still some fun to be found here, 20 years later, and I think that's pretty amazing.